Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and we got another solo album review, the newest project from Lana Del Rey. Did you know there's a tunnel under Ocean Blvd? Well, seventh time's the charm, right? Truth be told, I did not expect to have enough material for another Lana Del Rey review. I've said my piece time and time again, and by the time I reviewed Chemtrails Over the Country Club in 2021, I felt like I had reached something of a conclusive point in my contentious relationship with Lana Del Rey's albums. Granted, I also said that when I reviewed Blue Banisters and was proven wrong, but it turns out there's actually been more activity over the past year and change that I felt like a full-length review was worth my time. And hell, there's enough of you that keep showing up for it. Why not keep on sauntering into that abyss? And really, there are three things worth discussing, and the first is the aftermath of Blue Banisters, which was divisive to say the least. The album was messy, uneven, with a lot of awkward half measures that didn't really work, but also with enough moments that I was convinced it would have a cult fandom in and of itself. And I mean, discovering that Lana Del Rey purposely did not promote it that well because she was intending it as a defensive, explanatory project for all the controversy that on some level she didn't want anyone else to hear made even more sense. Of course, what most folks probably remember it most are all the memes with Dealer, which even as someone who doesn't like that album or that song, that kind of sucks. I mean, there was more going on that was worth analysis on that project. But you want to know what also sucks? Watching a whole swath of her fandom turn on her because apparently she may have put on some weight in some unflattering paparazzi photos, and then moralizing all of their complaints with a bunch of bastardized logic that you would never have brought out if it wasn't for a shift in the aesthetic and the slight fall off in 2021. As someone who has made a lot of harsh critiques of Lana Del Rey for damn near a decade now, it was just so obviously transparent and ugly, and not only showed that you knew and excused all of her other bullshit for years because she was serving the looks and the music, but also that your surface level moral convictions only go as far as your consumption. So fuck off! Now, this would be the time that a lot of the most cynical record executives would throw her under the bus, especially with up-and-coming acts like, say, Ethel Cain taking swaths of her audience by storm with her 2022 breakout album Preacher's Daughter. But I also think it's revealing that Lana Del Rey was not blackballed by the industry. Folks still want to work with her, which is why she finally showed up on Taylor Swift's Midnights and was able to recruit her most ever collaborators to date for this album, which many have described as her most difficult and impenetrable album to date. Well, I'm damn near a veteran with Lana Del Rey's music at this point. I was indeed curious. So what did we get with Did You Know That There's a Tunnel Under Ocean Blvd? Whew. Well, let me put it like this. This is the sort of album that feels like a natural continuation from Blue Banisters. It's messy, it's ramshackle, there's more swerves that don't really work, even if there's none that feel naturally mimetic. And like every Lana Del Rey album, it sprawls into a lot of sleepy, undercooked implications that even if you bought into her narrative, will not have the same magnetism as some of her strongest songs, especially as she's serving even less of the glamorous fantasy she built in the 2010s. If anything, it's got the feel of a story where if you're not already deep into the weeds, it's probably gonna lose you. Full of so many loose ends and sound and theme from records past that are finally seeming to be weaving together, but probably won't have that resonance if you miss them along the way. And I'll be damned, as someone who has actually followed along, I think it almost works. I think this is her best album to date. Now, that is a pretty heavy statement coming from me, given all the history, so let's add a bunch of qualifiers to that, most of which will fall into the category that if you don't like Lana Del Rey already, this album is not a jump-on point, nor will change your mind. It runs for 77 minutes, it's very piano ballad heavy, and probably could have been trimmed down and refined, which increasingly feels like less of a priority for her. She's more interesting in presenting the messy reality, so if words are going to spill off rhythm, or the songs spiral without structure, or her album opens with backing singers warming up, or if studio chatter spills into the mix, or the interludes run way too long. It's all part of the aesthetic. It's part of the point. Capricious glamour and perfection without looking like you're trying, they're considerably less important now. Now, all of this approach, it was laid down on Blue Banisters. I'm not surprised. But you can also tell the swerve to go back and work with more competent producers like Jack Antonoff, where his sweeping, gentle pulses, the slightly ragged strings, and gentle keys, they are a major plus. To say nothing of ironing out a lot of the mixing and mastering issues that were so frustrating on really her last two albums. It's also a factor that her delivery is staying in closer to her clear, lower to mid-range, where even when she slips into her higher register, she's got more control and balance. She's a better singer now. Yes, she'll occasionally try to cram a few too many words into the meter and the rhythm can feel a bit askew, but it feels a bit more purposeful this time. It's less awkward. Now, that does not excuse every dalliance with trap percussion that feels as stiff and sterile and awkward as ever, but there's something even about their inclusion that feels very agenda-driven. We'll get into it. Just enough of a signpost to the fans that want what passes for bangers from Lana Del Rey, so she can focus on what matters a lot more deeply to her. She's just serving another interest. But more than ever, that primary interest, it's family, both in her immediate relatives and whatever could pass for the family that she wants going forward, and both of which she also feels might be slipping through her fingers. Now again, the thematic seeds of this were planted on Blue Banisters, but that was an album that felt deliberately deconstructed of her predetermined ideas and framing, but with a series of half measures that prevented her from fully sticking that landing. It's why the writing felt more stripped down and free verse, the compositions feeling a lot more scattered. Hell, despite all the lethargic tempos and a few too many swerves, there does seem to be a bit of a sharper focus this time. Lana Del Rey is reckoning with her tangible but kind of precarious legacy and what she sacrificed to build it. She's always been conscious of the passage of time. That lingering decay has been lurking in the backdrop since at least Lust for Life, but where she could have more easily brushed it aside or glamorized riding the tide, there's really none of that in The Loss of Family, where tour kept her from going to the funerals. And this is where you can tell she's starting to peel back the layers and really get into the baggage beneath it, especially alongside her persistent failure to find a partner on this album or have the children that she desperately wants. The greatest adversary now seems to be time itself, but there's a difference between asking whether she'll be loved when she's no longer young and beautiful, and then potentially being at that place, living through that potential cruelty. Now, that also builds off Norman fucking Rockwell and Blue Banisters in turn. She has seen and been with so many men who fall into the pathetic places and can't live up to her, where she fits less and less into that conservative nuclear family that prizes youthful femininity, where she might be comfortable settling down, but when your family members die and you grow older without that stable partnership, the privileged foundation cracks even deeper. She's conscious that some of that old magic is starting to slip, and that creates tangible stakes for the drama. And for as much as Lana Del Rey is a deeply flawed and frustrating songwriter, it actually enables me to care about her narrative a lot more. The title track is a great example of that persistent fear of being forgotten, and even if parts of the song feel like coy sexual references, I mean, that's deeply interwoven into her art, and we see more glimpses of real vulnerability. And that fear echoes into the very hushed, whispery Kintsugi, where more of her legacy spills forth alongside a family funeral and the kids that will remember some old folk songs, and I wonder if any of her music will ever last that long. Although the second verse seems to draw a reference to some sexual violence, and now that has also become intermingled with her artistic narrative. I mean, I referenced that back when I reviewed Ultraviolence in 2014 and questioned a lot of the framing, but I will say this was a failure in my original review, where I didn't realize her attempt to claim some glamour in the moment. It was a mechanism to process trauma, hold a vestige of power. Here it's just more obvious, especially following on the Father John Misty collaboration Let the Light In, which, look, what happened years ago between them, it feels more in plain sight than they will ever outright admit. Just another striking chapter to her legacy, even as she's conscious that she's only playing the side piece. And that's got a lot less glamour when you're in your mid to late 30s. And she's also reckoning with that steep, darker cost of that legacy painted around her, specifically on A&W, with deliberate callbacks to ultra-violence beyond the rattling guitars for the first half. Probably one of the hardest songs to digest on this album, where she looks back at the audience, at you, as a woman who likely experienced sexual violence, and wonders just how many think she deserved it. Made all the more difficult by the second half of the song, where she finds herself sliding into that haze of debauchery yet again as the percussion gets heavier and glitchier, with the one hip-hop beat that works on this album against that string sample. Test just how far you'll extend your hand. It creates a messy sort of tension, because I have never believed that it's some sort of intentional, ironic deflection from her, which apparently puts me at odds with so many critics who bought into that, even though Lana Del Rey herself has said, even on this album, it's never been ironic. But for me, simply that bad framing and poor writing created implications that have persisted in the culture, and there is a privilege in the act of creating art around it to be sold to a mass audience. That's not an excuse to what was done to her by men in its wake, and the fickle media and fandom feeding into it. Back in 2020, when she pushed back against claims that she glamorized abuse by saying that she was just a very glamorous person, the internet mocked her, but I think in retrospect the internet may have missed the point. Glamour was what was holding Lana Del Rey together, and now that it's slipping, a much harsher reality is coming to bear, especially as a woman who refuses to play the victim, because her self-reliant, image-conscious conservatism shows exactly how much she understands her power in her space. And once you get all that context in mind, I mean, all the writing seems to make a lot more sense. I've seen some folks call Sweet a TikTok tradwife song as she tries to bring a man into her world, but note that there's all these questions that she's posing to him. There's no guaranteed security that pissed me off so much on Honeymoon. There's no guarantees here. Then there's Candy Necklace, where in the second verse she's spiraling, she's looking for support, where Rockefeller, My Umbrella, might as well serve as a plea for privilege, but it doesn't really provide any respite for her loneliness, even as there's a trace of some drugged out enchantment. Fingertips is basically an extended free verse moment of pain over faint keys and aching strings, where she rips open some old family wounds. I mean, come on, her mother sent her away as a teenager to get sober, and she's been away trying to succeed on her own as family members die and all the lost connections sting even harder. And that leads to the lonely journeys of Paris, Texas, with the gorgeous fluttery pianos, that greater sense of abandonment. And to Godfather, Please Stand on the Shoulders of My Father While He's Deep Sea Fishing, which is all about the fear of losing more and highlighting how it's more family that shaped her than any sort of industry plant accusations. Interesting context there. Unfortunately, it's got the worst lyrics on the album, where after calling herself folk, jazz, blue, and green, she has the line, regrettably also a white woman, but I have good intentions even if I'm one of the last ones. I mean, Lana Del Rey has never been good about writing about privilege. This is another excruciating example. But on the flip side, one of the best moments of the album is Margaret, a collaboration with Jack Antonoff and his band Bleachers, as she writes about his love story with his fiancée. There's some separation and an honest yearning and deeply felt happiness at seeing them find something that she so desperately wants in the echoes to Paris, Texas, but also not to the point where she takes away from his story. And between that and the lush arrangement and the other moment where the playful stage chatter feels very earned and sincere, it really makes it work as one of her best ever songs. Reminds me a lot of Love for Lust for Life. That's a huge compliment. And man, I wish she stuck the landing, because I don't really think the last three songs on the album work at all, and it's part of the big compromising factor that really prevents me from getting behind this. Because there are those poignant, deeply felt, emotional moments that show deep-seated struggles at the foundation of her worldview, tangible stakes, and yet just like on the last couple of albums, a desperate swerve back to something that feels more familiar and artificial, because otherwise getting too real kind of undercuts the huge swaths of her catalog. Now, Fishtail's probably the most tolerable, even despite the weirdly cheap-sounding trap percussion and the auto-tune, and highlighting this guy who bought into her stories and wanted her sadder instead of listening to what she actually wanted to say, play to an image but not reality. But then on Peppers, there's a lot of that image, with the Tommy Genesis sample and the trap percussion, with the casual disregard that she makes out with a partner after he had a positive COVID test. And then Taco Truck XVB features a bassy trap reprise of Venice Bitch with a lot of really awkward attempts at Latin elements preceding it, and it kind of shows the full extent of who she is. But she's also self-aware enough to know that you'll hate her anyway for going back to it. Spin it until you whip it into white cream. But truthfully, I don't hate her, because she already did this sort of thing once already on A&W, and more importantly, for as much as she knows how to bait the response, she's too complicated for a blunt instrument. I prefer empathy, because the messy side of her is probably just as true. It's also why I'm not as aggrieved by the Judah Smith interlude, which is a sample of a rather infamous megachurch pastor with a fair share of contentious statements, where his sermon here is more about himself than the service at large. And while you can hear Lana Del Rey snicker over the sample because she suspects this guy is plenty full of shit, the song is literally surrounded by A&W and candy necklaces, the subtext bleeds across, she'll also play the sample a little too long. She actually goes to that megachurch. She's still drawn to it. People are complicated like that. It's also probably the one instance on the album where the extra takes and chatter fits a bit more thematically. When you're revealing things this personal to leave so much studio chatter and metatext on the table, you do risk compromising the emotional verisimilitude of the album. But hey, when you're still within a system where you gotta do what works, wake up, you gotta make money. I mean, it just kind of sucks because having created some tangible stakes that actually brought me in, she is so quick to shove everybody out. Although on some level, that feels very believable too. The interesting thing with this album, though, is that for as much as I have praised elements in the writing, probably the most I have ever praised for Lana Del Rey, there will be a lot of fans that will say this has been there the entire time, and only now that I finally got it, that the subtext moved into text, what took you so long? I mean, I disagree. I actually went back to those old albums I don't like, and that hasn't changed. But I think after having my breakthrough when it came to understanding and contextualizing her albums, made this a much easier sit. And again, I'm comfortable calling it her best. Certainly her most honest and vulnerable in both the lyrics and the framing. I can also acknowledge when somebody I don't really like is also being treated like shit for bad reasons. And like with Blue Banisters, it leaves me a little bit unsure as to how well this will be received or for what reasons. I think it's hard to recommend. Again, I think it works best with the weight of context built up over years. It's not a jump-on point. And even then, there's a degree of self-conscious indulgence that makes it hard to praise for its best moments. But I'm also not going to deny that there are some of her best moments in terms of composition and songwriting, and while it's way less in your face, it demands more investment. At least for me, I think it's worth it. I mean, I'm not going to call myself a fan, I just think there's an understanding. Congrats on the engagement, Lana Del Rey. I hope you find what you're looking for. If you know, you know. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. I did not expect to have this much to say about this album, certainly not to be this positive, but hey, gotta be honest with y'all. Beyond that though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process, argue with me on Discord, or just support my channel beyond my merch, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I'll be okay, but the option's available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.